To me, Global Reach Out is inspiring.
Is connecting with God, reaching out to the world, and impacting life.
The stories that shared is so personal and it deeply impacted me.
Global Reach Out to me is reach out to the truth.
Connecting hearts, connecting lives. You're listening to Global Reach Out.
To me, Global Reach Out is inspiring.
Is connecting with God, reaching out to the world, and impacting life.
The stories that shared is so personal and it deeply impacted me.
Global Reach Out to me is reach out to the truth.
Connecting hearts, connecting lives. You're listening to Global Reach Out.
Hello friends, a very warm welcome to Global Reach Out. Today, we begin a new series called Oasis of God's Grace. Many people face challenges and difficulties which they could do nothing about except to simply receive God's grace. In this webcast, we hope you will learn more about God's grace, accept it, and enjoy it to the fullest in your life.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Johnson Lim, and I am the director of the Baptist Center for Contemporary Christianity. The topic of my podcast is God's amazing grace. One of the most common words found in the New Testament is the word grace. The word and its cognate appear about 200 times. Of all the biblical writers, the Apostle Paul has the most to say about grace. The word grace is a common expression on the lips of every believer, cell leader, and pastor. Everything seems to center around the word, doesn't it? When asked, "How are you?" a common reply would be, "I am fine by the grace of God." When a person is congratulated on his or her success, a typical response is, "By the grace of God, I did well." When a pastor is praised for his or her work in the church, almost instinctively, he or she would say it's all because of the grace of God. At dinner time, someone may even say, "Let's say grace before we eat." Grace is a precious word, but more importantly, it is a biblical word. Have you ever wondered what does this 5-letter word actually mean in the Bible? Sometimes a word is used so often that it loses its significance. As a result, a powerful word like grace can degenerate into everyday expression that loses its significance. Perhaps when you are asked to define grace, a smart answer would be to say that grace is like love. It is easier to experience than to explain. There is a mistaken notion that the concept of grace begins in the New Testament. The parochial myth that God in the Old Testament is different from the God in the New Testament, that is, the former is a God of wrath and the latter is a God of grace, must be debunked and challenged. As Carson remarks, the reality is that the Old Testament displays the grace and love of God in experience and types. And these realities become all the clearer in the New Covenant writings. I maintain that the idea of grace is present and alive, even if it is nascent in the Old Testament, although the term grace is not used. Anytime a person argues that an idea is invalid, if a specific word is not being used, he or she runs into serious exegetical problems. Example, the word Trinity does not appear in the Bible, but we know that it is true. In exegesis, an argument from silence is invalid. Interestingly, the word grace does not appear in Matthew and Mark, but it appears once in Luke 2 and thrice in John. Yet, who can deny that the life and teachings of Jesus reflect grace? Furthermore, who can deny that grace constitutes the gospel? Therefore, it is erroneous to argue that a particular concept is absent or invalid just because a particular word is not used. The word grace is also not used in 1 John, 3 John, and Jude. Grace is a cardinal concept in the scripture. Everything about God is about grace, and everything He does in relationship to us is based on grace. However, grace and works are antithesis. They are mutually exclusive. If God bestows grace on us on the basis of our merit or withhold grace because of our demerit, then it is no longer grace. From the scripture, we learn that we are saved by grace alone through faith. We are justified by grace. We stand on grace. Grace triumphs. Grace exceeds immeasurably. We can be strengthened by the grace of God. God's grace will prove sufficient in times of difficulties. We are also healed by grace, disciplined by grace, and called to live by grace. Without the grace of God, where would you and I be? Whatever we are and have is all due to the grace of God. Without the all-encompassing grace of God, our lives would definitely have been different. Without His sufficient grace, we may not have survived crisis. We begin with grace, and grace will lead us home. There are many things in the scripture that teach us about grace. When we understand the scriptural teaching on grace, our Christian living will take on a new dimension. The grace of God is like a multifaceted diamond, which has several aspects of saving grace, sustaining grace, sovereign grace, and serving grace. Let us explore the biblical perspective on the immeasurable riches of God's extravagant grace. Get ready for a journey that will take us to the oasis of God's grace. What is grace? For Greek enthusiasts, the word for grace is charis. While the word charis can be used as a greeting to express thanks, the underlying meaning of grace is that it is a gift, an undeserved, unexpected favor from God. Indeed, God is the grace giver. While God is the source of grace, Jesus Christ is the medium of grace. His life and teachings embody and mediate grace. Let us see how people have defined grace. Grace is defined as God's riches at Christ's expense. Grace is the unrestrained operation of love. Grace is the good pleasure of God that induces Him to bestow benefit upon the undeserving. Grace is pure, unaccompanied kindness and favor. Free sovereign favor to all the deserving. Grace is the celebration of life relentlessly hounding all the non-celebrants in the world. Grace in a nutshell. Grace is God's undeserved favor freely given to us. He gives us grace not because we deserve, but out of His goodwill and pleasure. In other words, the grace is always a gift and cannot be bought or earned. There are no strings attached. Grace has nothing to do with my performance, but His infinite goodness. Grace depends on His willingness to intervene in situations which seem hopeless. In other words, God's grace has nothing to do with our deservedness, but everything to do with His greatness and goodness. Alexander McLaren puts it beautifully when he says, grace in Paul's language seems love lavished upon the undeserving and sinful, a love that is not drawn forth by the perception of any excellence in its objects, but wells up and out like a fountain by reason of the impulse in its subject, and that in itself contains and bestows all the good and blessings. Grace is undeserving. It cannot be earned or repaid. His love does not depend on who we are, but who He is. He loves us because He is love. God's love is action and not reaction. Grace ceases to be grace if God is forced to withdraw it in the absence of any presence of merit. Let's be honest, there are some people, pastors, churches, who think God should not bless others for one reason or another, yet they seem to experiencing God's blessing. Why? In my opinion, the key explanation is the grace of God. Grace has meaning only when we ourselves, as fallen, unworthy of salvation and destined for hell. Neither our merits nor demerits determine the grace of God. If grace cannot be earned by merit, then it cannot be forfeited by demerit. The scripture declares that even out of our righteousness is as filthy as rags. We cannot make God do things our way just because we are obedient and sacrificial. To measure the grace of God in our lives by our commitment and service is to misunderstand the grace of God. Grace and works are incompatible. There is never grace plus works in our relationship with God. When God has begun by grace, He will complete by grace. Grace is rooted on the very nature of God. Everything that God does flows from the bountifulness of His grace. He is called the God of all grace. That is significant. He is not God of some, little, but all. He possesses all grace, and that is why grace is all sufficient for human exigencies. We are urged to boldly approach the throne of grace in order that we may receive mercy and find grace to give us timely help. Since Jesus Christ died and completely paid the awful penalty of sin, God could extend His grace to us through the forgiveness of sin. History has no blacker pages than when heavens turned dark and sun withdrew its light at Calvary. The cross became the rendezvous for God and humanity. The fallenness of humanity culminated at the cross. Isaiah 53:5 makes sense in light of Calvary. Everything becomes intelligent and meaningful in the light of the cross. Jesus paid it all. The debt of sin was cancelled. The rays of grace emanate from God and find focus in Calvary. Grace makes sense when seen in the light of the cross. It bears repeating that the basis of grace is God's goodness and greatness.
We will close here today. Please stay tuned with Global Reach Out, and let's meet again next week. Goodbye.
The program is proudly presented by Global Reach Out. We welcome you to share our live enriching webcasts with family and friends through our website, global-reachout.org. Let's reach out to bless more lives together. The program is proudly presented by Global Reach Out. We welcome you to share our live enriching webcasts with family and friends through our website, global-reachout.org. Let's reach out to bless more lives together.